All right, yes. So I've been a community organizer for most of my life, but I'm going to tell you about the very first political protest that I ever staged, which was in the fall of 1984. I was 16 years old. And at the time, Ronald Reagan was president, and he was doing this massive nuclear buildup. He was doing these deadly interventions in Nicaragua and El Salvador, and I found this incredibly terrifying and appalling and depressing. And I just felt like I had to do something. I had to protest somebody. And at that time, at my high school, military recruiters were coming to try to recruit students to join the military. And so I decided I was gonna protest. And so I made these signs on butcher paper that were sort of calling out US aggression around the globe, and I put them up on the building, right outside the building where the military recruiters were gonna set up camp and talk to students. I don't really know what I expected was gonna happen next exactly. I think thinking ahead, thinking strategically, these weren't really my strong suits at 16. I think I thought it was gonna cause a stir, you know? I think that other students might feel inspired to speak out. And when I went back that day at lunchtime, I think I imagined there was gonna be a crowd, you know, people are gonna be talking to me like, wow, what previously unpopular and unnoticed kid did this brave act of political dissent? But when I got there was nothing. There was no stir, there was no crowd, there were no signs, they were gone. So I went to the administration building, and I demanded answers, and I got ushered into the office of Dean Bud Call. Now, having heard Kelly's story earlier, I have to say, like, I wonder how this experience in my whole life would have been different if I had had the kind principal that she was able to engage her daughter's school. Dean Call, not so much. He was in his first year as a dean, and previously he'd been a coach and a PE teacher. In fact, he had been my PE teacher the year before. He was tall and athletic, and he had a chiseled chin and a really big bushy mustache, and he spoke in very compact sentences, very efficient. And he did not think much of me when he was my teacher. He was particularly unimpressed with my lack of upper body strength. I remember that we'd have these days in the gym when they put the ropes from the ceiling, and we'd like try to climb up, and I could never get more than like maybe a foot off the ground. And he'd just stand there and scoff. Greenson, that's the best you can do? Where the heck are my signs, man? Is how I would have wanted to confront him. But I was intimidated, so it probably came out more like a whine. Where are my signs? And he responded, he said, I tore them down. They weren't on a bulletin board, and you didn't get pre-approval. I didn't really know what to say to that, so I slunk away defeated. But then later that afternoon, I was talking to my very sympathetic US history teacher, Mr. Campbell, and he told me I shouldn't give up. And he gave me a copy of the Skyline High School Constitution, which I had never known existed before. But apparently during a period of more active student activism in the past, there had been some attempt to codify what rights students had and didn't have. So I took it home and I studied it. That night, I labored over a formal letter of protest, a stinging rebuke to Dean Call's suppressive tactics. Now I have it right here. This is the actual letter. 40 years old. And the reason I still have it is because, I've written better things in the last 40 years, but I've never written anything I was more proud of at the time, which is why I still have it. And in this letter, I thoroughly dismantled Dean Call's feeble rationale for destroying my signs. The school constitution stated plainly that students had the right to free speech as long as they didn't impact the teaching schedule. My signs hadn't impacted the teaching schedule. There was nothing about needing pre-approval, right? I don't know where that came from. And about the notion that the posters had to be on bulletin boards. The Constitution said, students have the right to express themselves through their speech and through bulletin boards, posters, leaflets, literature, and buttons. Okay, here's what I wrote. This is my favorite part. Quote, it does not state that posters must be posted on bulletin boards, but list them as separate, underline, methods of expression. Is one to assume that buttons and leaflets must also be posted on bulletin boards? The position of the administration is, comma, therefore, comma, unsubstantiated. I just have to pause for a second. Some of you may be too young to have actually operated an actual typewriter. So when you want to underline something, it's not like you just highlight and click a button, right? No, you have to hit the backspace key. Ka-chunk, 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 ka-chunk. And then you have to hit the underscore key under each letter. Flap, 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 flap. And it was time consuming, right? It was a pain in the butt. But it was really satisfying because you were making your point. With each flap, I'm going to get you, flap, 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 Dean Call, flap, flap, you pompous ass. So the letter closed with a sort of summation, and then my demand was I wanted a response. Within a week, a response. So I took the letter to school the next day, I dropped it off, and I waited the whole day for the inevitable summons to Dean Call's office, where he was going to capitulate and just admit that my arguments were perfect. But that didn't happen. No summons that day. In fact, not the next day either. The whole week went by, and my deadline passed for the response, and there was nothing. So I wrote a second letter. I'm not as proud of this one, really, but I think I kept it because of the first, really. I'm kind of losing my passion in it, you know. It's like, you know, I know you must be kind of busy. I'm just looking for a discussion. I think I made some points. So I dropped that off, and I waited for a few days, no response. So I decided, all right, I got to go back to the administration. I got to confront this guy again. And so I went, but every time I would go, he would not be in the office. And then one day, I saw him leaving school, heading to the parking lot after school, and I chased him down. And I got there, and I'm like, Dean Call, I'm here for a response to my letter. And he was like, come again? I was like, my letter of protest. And then the second letter about the signs. And he was like, remind me again about what that was about. So I went into my arguments. I cited the Constitution verbatim. I dismantled the argument about the pre-approval and the bulletin boards. I was so eloquent. I was like Clarence Darrow making a closing argument. I was like Thurgood Marshall. I was the embodiment of good argument and discourse. And afterwards, he just stood there. And then he said, you made a point there, Greenson. It was one of the most thrilling moments of my life. I felt my heart swell. I felt the rush of vindication, the satisfaction of having persevered over tremendous odds, of seeing justice done. I was sure this was exactly how Martin Luther King must have felt when they passed the Voting Rights Act. But then Dean Call, in his slow, deliberate way, he asked me a simple question. So, what do you want? And time stopped for a moment. I felt the blood rush from my face. I felt my swollen heart shrivel into a cold stone. What did I want? What did I want? I mean, I knew I wanted to win, and I had, and I knew I wanted to be right, and I was, and I knew I wanted to stand up to the man. And here was the man stood up to. But what did I want the man to do? In the years that have passed since then, I've often thought about what I could have asked for in that moment, right? I could have said, I want a formal statement in the school paper affirming student rights. I want a teach-in on campus about U.S. imperialism and colonialism. I want Noam Chomsky to speak at graduation. But having given the matter zero thought beforehand, my mind was totally a blank. I had to say something. Well, I'd like an apology. In a flash, Dean Call extended his hand towards me. Sorry. And he shook my hand, and then he was gone. He got in his car, he drove away, leaving me just staring at my hand where he had shaken it, and looking at it utterly and completely empty.